Final Fantasy VIII sets itself apart from the wider Final Fantasy series in a number of ways. Highly experimental in structure, mechanics and setting, it remains, even in light of the ever-evolving games of today, a unique entry that tried out several weird and wonderful things that have yet to be repeated since. The most remarked of these is of course probably the junction system, which was a highly divisive trade-out of a tried and true RPG magic mechanic. Yet beyond this, and having recently discussed the certain utopian idealistic energy of Final Fantasy VIII's world, I'd like to drill down and focus now on its unique depictions of transport and infrastructure, and consider how these unique elements complement and elevate this sense of a utopian setting, and once again speak to the unique nature of Final Fantasy VIII compared to its peers. Jumping right in, from the outset of Final Fantasy VIII we are called to adventure and we are assigned missions that see us travel to other continents quite early in the game. However, unlike most other Final Fantasies that offer personal and increasingly improving modes of transport, Final Fantasy VIII relies primarily on public transport, and most specifically early on, the use of trains. Now, this may seem like a minor element of the game, but it is interesting to see just how much it affects the structure, aesthetic, and arguably the player agency of Final Fantasy VIII, further removing it from the accepted conventions of the series. For example, in most other titles, whether it's Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy IX as the closest comparisons, the escape to the overworld is usually coupled quite quickly with an introduction to Chocobos, a player-controlled personal means of initial transport, which at its most detailed to date, we have Final Fantasy VII, which has an entire ecosystem of capturing, breeding, and naming Chocobos to keep in our stable. In Final Fantasy VIII, Chocobos, and indeed car rentals as a personal player-controlled means of transport, are included, they are in the game, but they are relegated to a near pointlessness in the overall progression of the game, with Chocobos in particular perhaps only added as a gesture to series tradition rather than any necessity of practical transport throughout the game. Looking back to trains and in terms of aesthetic, what we also have in the overworld is an active train service operating and being visible as we travel around. And indeed, one of the engineering and aesthetic spectacles of Final Fantasy VIII's world is the transcontinental horizon bridge that joins up the continents of Esthar and Galbadia, and necessitates the location of Fisherman's Horizon as this engineering way station and hub between the two. And even as trains do become less of a necessity story-wise, we are actually able to venture around this huge rail network if we choose to. So despite de-emphasising Chocobos and personal player-controlled travel, despite taking control out of the hands of the player, the train service was a really dynamic, unique aspect of public infrastructure and overworld design that sets Final Fantasy VIII apart. And as I say, we've never seen anything as involved and dynamic as an active train service in an overworld featured since in a Final Fantasy game. A final note on trains specifically is how, as a mode of communal passenger transport, they also alter the structure of storytelling very slightly too. So where Chocobo rides in other games are basically player controlled and it's us venturing from A to B to get to another location, because trains are a passive means of transport, it allows storytelling to take place while we are in transit, and the carriages of the train become a location for dialogue, character development, and a couple of integral scenes such as the train heist in Timber and the first Laguna Dream most notably. Beyond the trains, we have other incidental but curiously involved bits of communal travel. The interactive bus service that operates around Delling City being one, the sparsely seen Timber monorail being another, Balamb Garden, the White Seed ship, which are again used for harbouring large numbers of people, and even the majority of vehicles that we drive are militarily designed for the utility of transiting a large number of people. So what does all of this say about Final Fantasy VIII's world? How does it add to a sense of utopianism that is at odds with the other titles, and perhaps even the known world? So let's take a moment to dive into some real-world examples and the principles that sit behind communal travel, because I really think it would help frame why it's considered so aspirational and contributes to why Final Fantasy VIII is such an aspirational sort of world. Well, Public transport has, by its nature, a number of advantages that make it quite favourable. You are shuttling a large number of people in one vehicle, obvious implications on cost and congestion and sustainability compared to solo travel. There is also equity and opportunity offered to everyone, regardless of geography. So those living linked up in rural provincial areas are able to commute and access employment opportunities in central hubs and cities owing to public transport, which creates more egalitarian societies in theory. And one need only look at the advent of the Shinkansen in Japan to see the opportunities here, where Shizuoka to Tokyo, you can get there in less than an hour. Tokyo to Osaka, you can get there in 2 hours. And what we see there is a population that has acclimated and actively favours this system, with around 50% of daily commutes being by train, which compares to 10 to 15% in comparable countries like the UK and Germany, less than 5% in America. And the implications this has on congestion and urban planning are clear to see, with the liberation of space in Japan, permitting green spaces, even Shinto shrines that are several hundred years old, coexisting in densely packed modern cities like Tokyo, and urban planning is often designed around these sites rather than a mass clearing to make way for highways and roads and the like. There's an interesting comparison to be made here with countries like the UK and the US, since the post-war period saw each of them preside over massive infrastructure projects, with Japan favouring railway networks and culminating in the Shinkansen in 1964, the US developing its huge interstate highway systems, and the UK being stuck somewhere in between, having invented the modern railway in 1825, but in many cases and to this day relying on the same train routes and the underlying Victorian structures there. So very hard to innovate and build high-speed rail when you have these hairpin turns everywhere. But looking to the US in particular, I think this is a fantastic and a very powerful comparison to make with Japan and notions of public transport, because the development and the promotion of modern cars combined with the interstate system not only linked up the USA in a different way, but based on a completely different premise, which is that of individual liberty and the freedoms offered by the motor car. Now, America is hallmarked by stories of the open road, from Kerouac's On the Road to Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing to Don DeLillo's Americana. They are a staple of modernist literature, a spiritual succession perhaps to the frontiersmen and the adventurers that were pushing west in the 19th century, and a symbolic cornerstone of liberty and personal freedom. This notion of the car and the open road is bound then to ideas of the individual, of identity and status too, and that an individual isn't beholden to the strictures of train times and schedules, nor the direction of travel. It is ultimately about freedom. And this perspective leads to another major counter to the idea of public transport, and something much more common in Final Fantasy games outside of Final Fantasy VIII, I think, which is the acquisition of personal property, personal ownership, and the status and freedom that infers. The common progression from Chocobo to ship to airship is by its nature about increasing the freedom to roam for the player and the characters, and to roam with vehicles that the player has personally acquired and owns. The buggy in Final Fantasy VII, the tiny Bronco are prime examples of this, all the way up to the commandeered Highwind that we achieve in the end of the game. And these very bespoke, symbolically named airships like Ragnarok or Fahrenheit, Enterprise or Invincible, they all convey a sense of esteem and status and identity. Perhaps the best example of this is Final Fantasy XV's Regalia, which in form and function, and of course name, is an irrefutable flex of Noctis's status as a prince within the world. And while Final Fantasy XV is often compared similarly to Final Fantasy VIII, and indeed in some ways it is, the setting's musings on transport and transport infrastructure couldn't be more different, with the latter favouring and in fact centring around the freedom of the road, and many aspects of the game support that, including very agreeable fuel prices. Final Fantasy VIII, on the other hand, is much more, I suppose, Japanese and favourable of the public transport perspective. It's a clear advocate of the advantages of social transit, and while it doesn't omit car travel entirely, it does in many ways discourage it, with prohibitively high fuel costs being a counterpoint and counterexample to FF15, and also the ability only to rent rather than outright own a car in the game, which defers and deflates, I think, the status symbol and the ego identity of personal ownership, such as we have with the Regalia. So Final Fantasy VIII feels so different and perhaps so aspirational in setting compared to the other games because of this ability to transit in a very clean, communal and straightforward way. We are thundering unobtrusively through nature, under the sea, and through urban space on the trains. And again, to join back up with real-world perspectives on this and advantages on this, it has these lower cost implications and the ability to work around historical, cultural features, leading to the preservation of historic places. So, to use Final Fantasy VIII in-game examples, we have the old city of Dole, we have Delling City, and Timber, which are a very interesting take and clearly very preserved in their archaic, sort of European-esque architecture. They haven't been bulldozed to make way for a super modern highway. And even looking at the apogee of engineering and development in the world of Final Fantasy VIII, which is the futuristic city of Esthar, what we find there is it features a flying metro system around the city and walkways, so it's designed almost exclusively to this concept of an idealised, walkable city, which is advocated so much in progressive and sustainable driven sections of society. Now, that being said, I'd be remiss not to mention the village of Winhill. I think it's a very stark but subtle counterpoint to the virtues of railways. And Winhill being a province that's located in the Galbadia region, but it's nonetheless disconnected from the railway system. And actually when we visit Winhill, we find that it is comprised almost entirely of old people who have a sense of disconnect from the wider world. And in many ways they're as removed as the isolationists at Fisherman's Horizon, or the far off Shumi in the northern frontiers. And I think this shows how transport systems are democratizing only so far as they are connected up to people. So there we have it, a deeper dive on the utopianism and the coziness of Final Fantasy VIII as a snapshot of this sort of a solarpunk and idealized world, of which I think communal travel is a huge, if subtle, factor that affects so many aspects of this world and game experience, even if it's not immediately obvious. As I say, I think it contrasts beautifully with the more American-style highway systems and car ownership that we see in Final Fantasy XV. So these two, in their own ways, really represent two radically different approaches and perspectives to infrastructure. And just to wrap up, I'd like to stress that I'm not personally a car hater, and there isn't any ideological slant to this video, but I do love trains. I love the possibilities of what train travel can bring. I love the Eurostar. I absolutely love the Japanese railway system, which in many ways prompted this video, and Final Fantasy VIII does make me think of it a little bit. I do also like the Amtrak system in the US as well. There we have it, Final Fantasy VIII reflecting the machinations of transport and infrastructure design. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you'd like to buy me a coffee, that would be lovely. The links are available below.